So I thought I would, well, this is what I'm going to talk about. This is not a Heart Kids baby or a Heart Kids dad. It's the partner of one of my researchers and their little baby. But, you know, off the web you can only get Calvin Klein dads, and I wanted a photograph of a real dad. So particularly because lots of Heart Kids families, you know, come from the country, and you know, people have to manage farm life with down here, and so they're not sitting in the inner city drinking lattes. So I'd like the pictures to reflect this. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about the stresses, potential stress on the parent-infant relationship. What do we mean by good attachment relationships, and some findings from our cohort study done quite a few years ago now, where we asked fathers and surveyed them with questionnaires about what was going on for them. So, you know, from a kind of hypothetical point of view, the kind of things that might get in the way of forming a strong bond with your baby might be worry about whether the baby's actually going to live or not, and some sort of anticipatory grief, doing the kind of psychological work about what if the baby doesn't survive, leading to delayed bonding, just the physical separation of the baby and parents, particularly if there's already other children in the families, and you know, often dad is the one trying to attend to the toddler and the school-age child as well as the new baby and mum. Long admissions, multiple admissions, which are quite disruptive. Invasive medical procedures might shut the baby down, so the baby's less available for actually reaching out and responding to the parents' interactions. What I call derailed intuitive parenting. So, you know, at home it's a bit of trial and error, no one's looking, you can kind of sort it out. Whereas you're in a ward, there is a nurse 24/7 who's the expert on what to do with babies and what to do with sick babies, and that can be really disempowering, kind of get people off that kind of automatic track of what they would normally have done. And then parents who are quite overwhelmed by their own distress and trauma responses might find it hard to tune into what their baby needs. And then there's all the kind of practical and, you know, financial, material stresses of just living across two campuses, really, home and a hospital. And what we know about secure attachment relationships in the community is that this leads to better emotional competence in children, fewer behavioural problems, better psychological adjustment, better social skills, better relationships with peers, and sort of sets babies off on a positive trajectory for their life, really. It's really the main source of resilience in life. But what does that mean, a secure attachment relationship? So I thought I'd just show you a little video clip of a child who I think is 18 months old. It is a mother and baby, so it's not a dad and baby, but and it's a silent movie. It's produced in America for sort of teaching, so there's no sound. Oh, good. Okay, so the reason I show that is because then you can see what's important is that the mum or the dad are available, the child can use them as they need, mostly they can go off into the world. There's been quite a bit of stuff kind of on the web recently about the last 5 years maybe about attachment parenting, which is sort of all about hold the kid this close and never let them kind of go. And that's not attachment, that's got nothing to do with secure attachment relationships, that's some other story. But you know, this is sort of where we're aiming to get to, where children are available to use their parents as the circumstances require, and when they don't need to be up close and they're free to explore. And you know, you will all know better than me the ways in which being in hospital might kind of disrupt that process. And now I just want to show you a little bit of video of a newborn baby to show, because again, if you kind of read, you know, human development textbooks and things, they'll tell you that this process happens after about 4 months of age. But I want to show you this newborn baby.
Within a few minutes of birth, as long as everything has gone well, babies are ready and willing to be social and sociable. Ethan is just a few seconds old here. He's crying as the midwife passes him back to Mum. As soon as he's in Mum's arms, he begins to settle. Within 10 seconds, he's calm and quiet. A few moments later, Mum offers Ethan her breast, but Ethan's much more interested in looking at Mum's face. She talks to him. He clearly responds. When his dad speaks, Ethan turns to him. And when Mum replies, Ethan looks back up at her. Ethan already knows these voices, and he knows they're important to him. A little later, Ethan really shows us what he can do when he's put in his dad's arms. When John sticks his tongue out, Ethan looks hard, concentrates, and then sticks out his own tongue. Ethan does the same thing again a moment or so later. While Ethan is still in his dad's arms, his mum speaks. Ethan immediately looks round and keeps looking at his mum. So, just a few minutes into his life, Ethan is already interacting very deliberately with the world and the people around him.
For me, it was lovely. I mean, just to really have that bond with Ethan when he was first born, and to actually see that he recognised who I was.
So I know this won't have been an experience for some of you whose babies were very unwell when they were born, so you know, it's a bit in two minds about kind of showing this. But I think what's important is it kind of underlines what a baby's capacities are when they're first born, and how impinging medical treatment and the medical illness and coping with the illness might be for the baby as well as the parents, and how that might get in the way of the relationship. But also, this is why we're so interested in the work that Michael presented this morning on the toddler's cortisol responses, because this might be the kind of stuff that is contributing to that difference in the responses and disrupting the biological stress system. So as you can see, the baby's very tuned into dad as well as mum. It's not just mum. So there's hardly any literature looking at fathers and medical illness in their children and the impact on fathers. There's a bit more on the father's stress response, but very little on fathers' relationships with the children. But the very small available literature that generally has quite small sample size talks about the kind of things I was saying that we might hypothesise. Lots of worry, sadness, feelings of loss of control, apprehension in actually having physical contact with the baby, and uncertainty about, is it worth investing in this baby if they're not going to make it? So we did study fathers when we did this cohort study some years ago here, and oops, that's a list of investigators. It was when Sam Menahem and Andrew Cochrane were here before they went to Monash. And what we did was we recruited babies who had surgery in the first 3 months of life, and they were recruited while they were inpatients. And then we aimed to collect data, in fact some of you might have been our participants, aimed to collect data 4 to 6 weeks after discharge from hospital. And we had a questionnaire for the mother and a questionnaire for the dad, and we interviewed the mother and the father, sometimes separately, but if they requested jointly, then we did a joint interview. And we got some information from the database. So what we ended up with is 63 fathers being interviewed, which is really quite a large sample of fathers, and 55 returned questionnaires. Quite a few of the interviews were done on the phone, either because people didn't want to traipse back to this hospital yet one more time, or because it just wasn't convenient to spend the time while they were attending the medical appointment with the child. I've realised I've taken a bit too long, so I'm going to go to the results. The first thing we did, well, one of the things we did was the paternal postnatal attachment questionnaire, and that's a scale that we kind of embedded in our study questionnaire. It's got questions like these. When I'm caring for the baby, I get feelings of annoyance or irritation. How often? Or usually when I'm with the baby, I'm impatient or I'm extremely patient. And there are positive ones as well. I enjoy the baby or... So overall, which is good news, we found mothers and fathers that their scores were similar to Australian community mums and dads, but 15% of the mothers and 20% of the fathers, 19%, had scores one standard deviation below the community mean, which means that 20% of the fathers had very low attachment feelings, much lower than 85% of the population. So that's a bit of a concern. And then when you can drill down into the subscales on the questionnaire, there was no difference in the amount of patience and tolerance the dads had, but it was harder for them to feel affection and pride or to have pleasure in interaction. That was a really strong one. And that was like a quarter of them were right down the low end of the scale for affection and pride. And you kind of get it, like it's kind of hard to boast about how robust your baby is when your baby's hooked up to wires and recovering from surgery or about to have surgery and you're not sure if they're going to make it or not. So you can see kind of what an impact on the normal experience of fatherhood that this could be. The actual characteristics of the illness and things like parent education, blah, 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 none of those bore any relationship to the measure. But the significant associations with the scores, particularly for dads, was length of time at home before surgery. So if it had taken a while for the baby's cardiac condition to declare itself and then the baby was admitted to hospital and had surgery, then those fathers had higher patience and tolerance scores, more pleasure in the interaction, and their total score was higher as well. So that was kind of protective, probably not so great for the baby's heart, but quite protective for the relationship between the dad and the baby. And then the amount of time at home since discharge, because they filled in the questionnaire somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks, the longer the time they had at home with the baby, that also increased their pleasure in interaction and affection and pride. I mean, it kind of makes perfect sense, but we demonstrated it as well. Then in the interview, we had a question, do you think that the surgery, the illness, the hospitalisation has impacted on your relationship with the baby? And we asked the mums and the dads. I've done the mums in pink and the dads in blue. And the dads were much more likely to just give a definitive yes. Whereas, you know, some mums would no or initially but not now. But the dads was almost universal. And so then we said, well, how? Like in what ways? And what we did is we looked in depth at all of the answers and then we looked for common themes. And we clustered them. And that's the overall graph, but I'll go through each bit in steps. And for quite a number of fathers, the relationship was strengthened and they talked about positive feelings and responsive behaviours. So in that sense, you could say the attachment system kind of worked, like it just made the fathers feel very protective. The kind of things that were described were greater closeness and love, thinking about the baby when not together, grateful to the baby for surviving. If you can love your kids any more than you do, I think it makes you appreciate even more what you've got. You realise how fragile things are. We're lucky because we were able to be fixed. You know, you can see the dad's really strong identification with the baby, like they're in it together, so very close bond. I think I've got another example of that. Yeah, it's probably made us closer together, just knowing that we could have lost him, stuff like that, not taking him for granted. And then behaviours that were different in the direction of strengthening the relationship were usually responding more quickly to the baby. It's hard to say, probably a bit easy. For example, I put the other child to bed and let cry, but because of the strain on the baby's heart, I pick her up. I feel she's experienced enough. Spoiled her, don't want to put undue pressure on her heart. Jump up quicker with her than with the other two children. So, much more responsive and more immediately, which you can completely understand. And then there were some who talked about the medical condition, in fact, facilitating the relationship. I managed to spend the first 2 months of life with her, something a lot of fathers don't get. So obviously that father's work circumstances were such that he could spend that amount of time. But also, I guess potentially more time than if the baby had been healthy at home and sort of all the women were hovering around all the time. Whoops. Now, in terms of strain, it was 11% of fathers talked about a strained relationship. Hard to feel emotionally close to the baby. And the two things that drove that seemed to be the fear of death of the baby and impediments to interacting just because the baby was so sick. I found it difficult at the start. Put a bit of space between me and him, just in case. Now we're mates. So it was like a big wobble, but they managed to recover. At first I didn't want to be with him, but now I can't get enough of him. And then health consciousness was another theme. I always question even the smallest thing to see if something else is behind it. Overprotective. I won't let anything go by. Although by saying that, I better let him get a few germs off the ground. So it's sort of like the gap between the heart and the head. They kind of know, it's actually better if you have a bit of exposure to germs. And then there were some dads who said no impact, but almost with determination, there will be no impact. This isn't going to get the better of it, sort of thing. So these dads talked about treating the baby as if they didn't have the cardiac disease, treating the baby the same as the other siblings, or trying to maintain normal family relationships, not letting this sort of send the whole family system off course. I'd say it hasn't. Mainly, one thing I often say to myself is not to treat him differently just because of what he's been through. I wouldn't want him to be seen differently. I wouldn't want to treat him differently. I'd end up with a spoiled brat. So doing this sort of, for the good of the child. And then another dad, not really, I'm at work mostly, which I think is sort of quite poignant because that sounds a bit disconnected, really. And then there was this theme of respect and admiration, some of which kind of comes through with the other themes as well. She's shown a lot of character and fight. If anything, our regard and respect for her has grown. And this also came through with mothers, the kind of awe towards the baby, what the baby had been through and what the baby had managed to kind of fight against the odds. So that's sort of the summary of what the father said in interview. So, quite a strong group, the relationship was strengthened, but then these other impacts, some of which were quite significant and others which may have been less of an issue really, like health consciousness in and of itself, unless it becomes really serious helicopter parenting, was okay. So I have a bit more time, don't I? Yes. I do? Well, that's good. I thought I wouldn't. And so I can talk a bit fast, so sorry if I gallop through that. But I've also got some other data. This was data that was analysed by a student of mine from the same study. And we asked parents, what did you find difficult about being in hospital? About the hospital experience? Is that the 5 minutes? Yeah, great. What did you find helpful and what would you like to be different? And there were just a couple of things there where there were differences between the mums and the dads, and I thought that was worth pointing out. So the question about did the hospital provide enough help, the dads actually said, more of the dads said yes, which is a bit of a surprise to me because I think they must have low expectations because, social work service 9 to 5, some mental health service 9 to 5, it can be really hard for dads to be here 9 to 5. So I was quite surprised by that. And I'll just go to, it's worth you probably knowing that the categories that people talked about, again, we looked at the themes. So the context of the hospital was difficult, just worry about the baby, parents' own health and well-being, the unknown, all the waiting, not having the right kinds of information. And the number of categories, like the difficult things that came up, you can see that quite a lot had 4 or 3 or 2. So there's more than one thing that was really hard. Then in terms of the baby, this is the bit that I wanted to show you. It was the dads worrying about the baby dying more than the mums. So the mums may have had the same worry, but I think what the mums do is obsess about the feeding, maybe appropriately, but the mums fix on the feeding. It's something they can do about the baby's life and death, and it kind of symbolises life and death, whereas the dads are, I think, silently sometimes worrying about the baby's survival. And no dad, where they were interviewed with the mum, no dad mentioned it in front of the mum. It was only the dads who had the private telephone conversation who mentioned it. While in there, it was tough to sit with. I was reading the paper about the Cricket World Cup. I thought that'd be good to take him to. Then I think stupid things like if he makes it through. Very sad. The other thing that was hard was relationships. So, women love social networks. Women love friends. We like talking. And for the dads, it's a mixed blessing. We've had a gutful of explaining to everyone. I had to do a ring around. It's such a big thing to explain. I was just replaying it in my mind. I gave too many people information, who to tell, who not to tell. And, that got mentioned quite a number of times. And so sometimes the extended family were kind of tricky. In terms of support, the mothers talked about extended family and friends being a support, but they didn't really figure for the dads as a support. And the dads here might have some ideas about why that might be. And so in terms of this bit of the study, 3/4 name more than one stressor. The baby's health is the number one issue, but this outer world stuff, like living across 2 campuses, dealing with the other children, dealing with the impacts on your workplace, your capacity to go to work, financial stress, they all have a big impact as well. The social network is a resource and a burden, and mothers are helped by other parents, but fathers aren't helped by other parents as much. So that could be a good place to stop. And I think we're going to have questions after Pepe's talk. So.